So I'm going to continue my sculpture review podcast. I am not going to try to read the questions at the bottom, and I won't necessarily pause very much in my presentation, but I hope if you have time that you will pause and discuss some of these questions. So let's continue with the theme of the iconography of power. The veristic sculpture on the left probably exaggerates the patrician's age. This contrasts sharply with Greek sculptural ideals. We see less worship of youth and beauty, more admiration for the wisdom that comes from age. The statue of Augustus more clearly and deliberately echoes the Greek emphasis on youth and vigor, but we also see a number of important political symbols. Augustus wears the breastplate of a warrior, but also the cloak of a judge. Military success was important to his legitimacy, but the Pax Romana he established after close to a century of civil war was even more important. The breastplate includes a number of gods participating in the return of the Roman standard seized by the Parthians. They're approving Augustus's reassertion of Roman power. The statue is identifiable as Augustus. It's a real portrait. The man himself mattered. The Cupid is a reference to the Julian house's alleged descent from Venus. Note that the contrapposto aligns Augustus with the heroism of classical Greece and Pericles' leadership, but not with democracy. Augustus was no democrat. Moving around the world and forward in time. In the wall plaque from the Obus Palace, we see hierarchical scale, the disproportionately large head, and an image of the king stepping on a fallen enemy. Also note the large cohort of attendants, another sign of power and authority. The ndope, or portrait figure of King Miche, like the statue of Menkera, represents an idealized, not an actual king. He too wears a serene, eternal expression. We also see the king's symbol, a drum with a severed hand. The veranda post sculpture uses hierarchical scale to highlight the significance of the senior wife, but note that it's the king who is shown sitting on the throne. Okay, the cape isn't sculpture, but these works do have important elements in common. They both reflect a focus on mana, or vital force, and its relationship to ancestors. The cape contains genealogical information. The statues are thought to be ancestors protecting the island, but they may have been images of founding settler kings. The top knots may have been a symbol of power. There's a lot we don't know about these statues. The American founders deliberately cultivated parallels to the Roman Republic. The bound rods, or fasces, symbolize the strength through unity. In this case, the 13 rods represent the 13 original states. George Washington is also wearing the badge of Cincinnatus, the Roman general who refused to seize dictatorial power, but instead returned home to his farm. The George Washington statue, like the Roman statue, includes naturalistic details. Note, for example, the missing button and the protruding stomach. Both of these statues combine military and civil symbols, representing two sides of a leader, but there is no hint of divinity in George. The shrine figure honors the right hand, which holds tools or weapons, makes sacrifices, and conducts rituals. It has traditional masculine associations of strength and potency, carved from hardwoods that are also viewed in this culture as masculine. And of course, power is exercised through the Nkisi statue. Note that some sculpture serves as an actual repository for the spirits or God. This was true in Hindu and Greek religions. It was not true in Christianity, although iconoclasts worried about this, and not always without reason, or in Buddhism, although again, the Jowo Rinpoche comes closer to actual image worship and is viewed to have certain spiritual powers. So before we leave power and authority, what do these figures convey? This, of course, is the great army of the Qin Emperor Shi Huangdi, who unified China and ruled with brilliance but brute force. The soldiers are 6 feet tall, taller than the Chinese of the time. They are differentiated to represent different regions, symbolizing the emperor's feat of unification. Do not mess with this emperor. And switching gears, what functions do these have in common? They were both buried with the ruler and designed to serve that ruler in the afterlife. All three of these works signal the high status women held in these cultures, or in Egypt's case, this rather strange cultural interlude. And speaking of which, remember that sculpture from the Amarna period is very different from other Egyptian art. It is much more naturalistic, does not have idealized human shapes. Okay, sorry, I ran out here of space for labels. A kore is female, right? And kores keep their clothes on. Goddesses are allowed to disrobe. Here we see the progression from archaic to classical to Hellenistic. Note the deeply incised drapery lines, the wet drapery look. The grave stela is a domestic genre scene, a scene from everyday life. That's a term you need to know. What work that we've just seen might be compared to it? By the way, this is also a good place to note the difference between sunken relief, which we see on the Amarna sculpture on the right, and the higher relief of the grave marker on the left. I would put that somewhere between bas and high relief. The work on the right is not required, but it's also a Greek bronze. What period do each of these belong to and why? The statue on the right is classical. Note the more severe, serene expression. This is an idealized warrior. The seated boxer is Hellenistic. The composition is more twisted and the figure shows much more emotion. The tired, bruised athlete is not idealized. So this is an old AP question on a work that's no longer required, but we see features that identify both as Hellenistic: realism, emotionalism, and a twisted form. So these are both Roman works. They both depict battles, and they both include a lot of realistic details. But think about how the work on the bottom, the Ludovisi battle sarcophagus, differs from the scene of Trajan's triumph over the Dacians. Well, first, formally, Trajan's column uses columns. It proceeds, or actually uses registers. It proceeds in an orderly narrative and depicts inevitable Roman victory. It is sculpted in relatively low relief so that the shape of the column remains dominant. The Ludovisi battle sarcophagus is carved in much deeper relief, and it has a more crowded and agitated, less controlled composition. The Ludovisi sarcophagus, interestingly, was made only about 150 years later than Trajan's column, but the Roman Empire that produced this work is much less confident. The Romans won the battle being depicted here, and indeed the youthful Roman general on top is shown without weapons, a sign of his strength. But this is a more chaotic world, and the fall of Rome is approaching. Since we've been looking at reliefs, let's take a quick look at some other examples of relief sculpture from the course. Do you recognize these? This time I deliberately left off labels. So on the upper left, we see the churning of the ocean milk frieze from Angkor Wat. This depicts a Hindu religious narrative. Vishnu wraps a serpent around Mount Mandara to rotate the mountain and churn the sea. We see both devils and gods in this image. In the upper right, we see Queen Maya returning to give birth to the Buddha. This is from the Borobudur Buddhist temple in Indonesia. Despite the cart, there's less sense of movement. This is a more static composition. The image on the bottom left is the Last Judgment from the Romanesque church of Sainte-Foy at Conques. In Conques, France, It has some intriguing devils as well. I blew up a section on the right. So, what do all four of these relief sculptures have in common, including the Ludovisi sarcophagus? Do you remember this term? It was a long time ago. These works all exhibit horror vacui, or fear of empty space. Every bit of space is crowded with carving. This is actually very typical of a lot of ancient sculpture from a variety of cultures. So before we leave friezes, here are three relief sculptures from our four relief sculptures from our Art of Americas unit. Top left is a relief sculpture from Chauvin de Huantar in Peru. In the bottom left, you have a figure from the Mayan Yaxchilan lintel 25. On the top right, the Aztec calendar stone, and the bottom right, the Coyolxauhqui stone. Sorry, I still can't pronounce that properly. So what formal qualities do these have in common, and what content is similar? They all contain images of animals that have symbolic significance. Jaguars in the Chauvin relief sculpture, jaguars representing one of the eras in the calendar stone. We see a vision serpent with Lady Jacques and a ball of feathers and eagle heads on the Coyolxauhqui stone. There is a strong tie to ritual and especially an association with sacrifice. And again, these are all relatively low relief sculptures, although the Yaxchilan lintel is a little deeper relief. And more friezes. We see the Panathenaic procession from the Parthenon and the friezes at the Apadama at Persepolis. So how would you contrast these works with the friezes you've just seen? They're calmer, more measured. This is more a depiction of reasoned power. This is probably further than you will be able to make it in class. I have another sculpture review, which you can listen to online.